Today's presentation is about trust and confidence in councils during COVID-19 and tells us what the public think. So what we're going to find out today is six things. The first three about points about trust and satisfaction. Those of you who've been to Performance Networks conference before know that we've done satisfaction surveys previously. And there are 3 points that lead on for the previous surveys that we've done. And the trust, that is first, the public trust you, that is councils and councillors and council staff, more than ever. They also trust councils as a body to spend their taxes on them more than other levels of government. And you'll know that we've previously surveyed levels of satisfaction with different council services that are often provided, which there are performance networks that cater to. And you'll find out that the satisfaction levels are up on all those levels of service, those in roughly the same amount as from where they were last year in the same order, but social care is the one that's possibly gone up a little bit higher than others, and we'll talk about that. There's also 3 points about current and future challenges, which we're going to come to after the general levels of satisfaction. And that is, we asked a new question this year about residential aged care, and it found that councils are most trusted to provide that service, more than anyone else. We also found that we asked a question about, before the current lockdown, about how people felt about council key workers during the first lockdown. And people expressed a high degree of satisfaction with council key workers during the first outbreak of the pandemic and their response, which is obviously very relevant given the current discussions about pay. Climate change is also still a priority, which we asked questions about last year, but just slightly less than it was last year, but still a very strong priority, and we'll analyse that in more detail. Just a little bit about the survey. The survey was conducted, this is the fifth of 5 surveys we've conducted for APSE, and most of the questions have been the same, but there's been some very significant additional questions about the role of council key workers during COVID-19 and on residential aged care. The survey was conducted between the 12th and 16th of October in 2020, and all the information was balanced by all the usual samples sizes, so it's proportionate to the British population as a whole, but with some booster samples in Northern Ireland and Wales to make sure we've got some figures to compare results in those areas against the national average. So I've got to talk about trust first, and the key fact is relative trust is very high in local authorities and councils. Trust in councillors is the highest compared to government ministers since 2016. Trust in councils has moderately increased, but its trust in government and MPs has continued to be low, based on reflecting last year's also very low performance, while many people do distrust anyone. And that's why I say trust is relatively high. Trust is relatively high because some people don't trust anyone, but it's simply the fact that all the other alternatives score very, very poorly. So in terms of the question of who makes decisions about services that are provided in your local area, who decides what gets done and how, 4.5 times people trust the local council, 54%, over the government, 12%, to make decisions about how services are provided in the area. About the decision makers, councillors are 9 times more trusted over government ministers at only 6% to make decisions about their local area. And 5 times more people trust councils at 55% to provide local services over a private company, which is at 11%, or the government, 11%. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. That's the breakdown of the trust in government councils to make the decisions. Trust in councils has risen 3 points since 2019. And again, given the timing when this was done, it's no surprise that trust is higher in councils in the north of England and lower in the government. Trust in councillors is higher than in 2019, but trust as ministers is lower by 2%. The trust gap is again largest in the north of England. Again, this was obviously a survey conducted about the time that Manchester was going into lockdown, but I think reflects a broader experience of people about the nature of government and the relationship between councils being seen to advocate for them, whilst the government was seen to possibly be not out of touch, not in touch with people during that period. Who delivers the service? I think this is a very important question, and I think what you can see here is that the council, in terms of who's going to deliver a service in your local area, is more trusted by the local council of 55%, and the alternatives like a private company or the government or is both very low, and that's at 11% each. More people say none of them or don't know. So we are coming to a question about money. And that firstly ask people a question about, do you think enough of your taxes are spent in your local area, which is how much does my area get? And people certainly think their local area doesn't get a lot, as much as it should do, which is not a surprising response. But if you look on to the next question, which is, who do they trust to spend it? And if you're looking at what happens in the local area, you can see that the government, should the government keep more money to spend at the national level on services for them, or should it be provided for local councils? Then, as in last year, there is a huge amount of people who answer 79% of people have, in this particular type of survey, they're presented with a dial, which basically starts at number 5 on the dial. So 79% have moved rightwards to say that they would like that not enough is spent at a local level. And that's a very significant decision for people. Only 10% of people said too much. So the level of trust in the council to deliver the service over the government is quite high. And I think that's very important when it comes to looking at other services the council could provide, or indeed funding for the ones they currently receive. People recall that we've surveyed on an annual basis the level of satisfaction when people are asked to give a score between 0 and 10, with the median position being 5, 10 being I'm very satisfied, 0 being I'm very dissatisfied. And whilst all council services or services in the local area have received a improved score in last year, what you can see by looking at this chart is that there's quite a difference. Parks is the one that scores the most highest, and the amount of affordable housing is the one that scores the lowest. Those two, that broad reflection of services and you can just read down there, but it goes parks, waste, schools, meals, lighting in streets, sports facilities, street cleaning, level of adult social care, winter maintenance, footpath maintenance, general road maintenance, and affordable housing. That's the order. The order doesn't change very much, except for adult social care, but they've all gone up. Now I'm going to go through the detail of that now. But you can see that they've all gone up. The dark green line is the score from last year, so from this year, and the light green line is last year. And you can see that in all instances it's gone up, but it's gone up most in adult social care, which was actually the third least favourable option last time, but has moved up to 5th least favourable. Possibly because people, and I think it's an interesting thing that people have obviously improved their opinion of their satisfaction, though I suspect when we go into it, it's actually about who's satisfied and their age and who's not, because I think there's some, when we go into the detail, I think some very different responses from people who are older, who are less satisfied, and those people who are younger who are not so worried. The highest score is for parks, and you can see here 84% of people are satisfied. That's across the board, and I think reflects very well on probably the high regard that parks are held in and been used a lot during the this year during lockdown. School meals, people, and it doesn't matter if you're a parent or not a parent, the scores are approximately the same. With you have a good view of and about school meals and their provision, and obviously their importance. You can see 79% of people are satisfied with the level of the type of school meals and the level of what they're receiving. Waste and recycling. What you see, looking at the chart here, is that the level of waste and recycling, and the people have expressed a 77% satisfaction with the current service. Only 16% of people chose to say they were dissatisfied. And again, those are quite similar across all areas and age demographics. Satisfaction with lighting on the street is also 77%, and who had a high level of satisfaction, and an average rating of 6.8. So, and if you look at one of these screens, in this particular case, you'll see that the highest level is an average score of 7. So if you look at one of these charts, you'll see that most of them form the same pattern, where the highest people have gone to say, I'm fairly satisfied at a 7 with the level. So the amount of people who express some level of satisfaction is between a 6 and a 10 as you move along the screen. But obviously that varies between the very high amount who put it to 7 and the lesser amount that have put a 10. Leisure and sports, 6.5 is the score. 78% of people are satisfied to some degree. It's interesting, most people score the service at about a 7, which means they think that it's okay to good, but not probably outstanding. And the amount of people who are scoring a 10 is obviously starting to drop if you look at the far end of the on the right hand side of the graph. Street cleaning, 70% of people are satisfied, but there's also just a slight increase in the amount of people who are saying they are dissatisfied, which is 22%. And that means the average score is down to 6.3. Social care, 61% of people are satisfied, 26% are not. There is, and this figure is fairly standard across all the age brackets, but I think what's really important here is that there's just starting to be a small increase about people who are dissatisfied, who are older, and we'll come to that later. Going through footpath maintenance, again, possibly people doing a bit more walking during COVID, but this score is up on last year, just slightly. 5.8 is the score. 62% of people are satisfied, but not that many people giving it a 10. Now, the two issues that I think have came last year and have come last this year is road maintenance. Satisfaction level of general road maintenance, 41% of people said they are dissatisfied, and only 50% of people said they're satisfied, and comes out a score of 5.2 as an average score. And you can see that whilst there is actually the most likely score that people have given is a 7, the second most likely score given is a 4, which is showing some degree of dissatisfaction, as opposed to being extremely dissatisfied, which would be a 0. But it's interesting that people have given that score. Scotland actually has the highest level of dissatisfaction, which I think is very interesting, given that's the score that's being recorded there is is out of proportion to the score that most people are given in other parts of the country, even though it's of a reasonably small sample size. Now, housing is the one that's actually given is the only one where less than half the people express that they're satisfied. It's about the amount of affordable housing in the area. Now, what stood out about this is actually, again, it's one of those areas where people are more likely to express dissatisfaction if you live in London in the south. If you're a C1, that's in social marketing terms as A, B, which are higher income earners, C1, which is a white collar professional, versus a C2, which is your white man band type of person. Ds and Es are lower income earners. C1s are much more likely to be renting these days, particularly if they're single, which is another group of people who are find it hard to get on the housing ladder, or to find appropriate rental accommodation. And so, not surprisingly, all those groups have actually expressed higher than average dissatisfaction by a significant amount with the amount of affordable housing that's available in their area. Now, what's interesting is that we ask a question every year about the amount of funds out of those 11 service areas you would like to, if there were fresh funds available, what percentage you'd give to each one. Now, the scores have remained roughly the same as last year, in the sense that social care is a priority, but and obviously road maintenance, affordable housing are also priorities, but to a slightly lesser extent. But different people have different priorities, and it's unsurprising is that let's go back. It's unsurprising that, in fact, those over 55 give a much higher priority to social care, whilst some of the people we talked about earlier, those who are younger, those in the south, give a much higher priority to affordable housing. So those over 55 are very much in favour of spending more on social care. I'm going to talk about something completely different, which we've done for the first time this year, and that is we asked a question where we asked people to think back to the COVID-19 public health emergency lockdown. Remember, this is in early October before we went into the current lockdown. How do you rate the efforts of your local council's key workers in keeping essential services going? And 79% of people moved the dial right, which means they gave a score that they were quite, and I think this indicates a very high level of satisfaction with local council's key workers. We've possibly all seen the Christmas jingle about dancing around the garbage cans, or boogie on down around the garbage cans, I think it is. And I think the regard that I think extends not just to NHS staff, but to all council staff that provided emergency services in the bins are a really important and obvious part of that is appreciated. Whereas only 12% expressed dissatisfaction. I would suggest there are a lot of services that would score quite different results. So I think that's a very good result in these circumstances. So what's interesting, reflect this is another question that we've asked, which is who's trusted on providing residential aged care? Obviously, we know that in COVID-19, its first outbreak, and there was a lot of a huge impact in residential care services, and I think it's raised the question about, given we've got an under provision and also not a very well supervised and maintained sector, who should be responsible for running it? Who should be providing the service? And with 40% of people trusted the council most to do that, and that trust is much higher amongst those who are older. And what you can see is that it's far more than any other potential provider. Both the private company and the government score much lower, and and given that 11% of people don't know, um, getting effectively 2.5 times the score of the next possible option, which is the government or a private company, I think is a very respectable result. But given that there's a large amount of people who don't know uh, who they should, with a little bit of persuasion, I would think that most of the public who are well disposed towards councils as a trusted authority to provide other services in their area could be persuaded to allocate their support to a council-run services if councils were going to frame a campaign around they should be funded to be the provider or the main provider in the sector. One of the things we also looked at was climate change. And this year, we looked at, we asked the same questions as last year, and we got some very interesting responses. And I guess it comes down to the fact that they still see councils to take a leading role in the sector, and they see as a challenge that will still maintains its importance, even though possibly in the current environment with COVID-19 is not quite as important as it was just at the moment. And our questions reveal that. 70% expect that local communities have to respond to the effects of climate change in their area. That's a high score. It's almost as high as last year's 74%, which means the public think this is an issue which they will have to deal with, and their local authority in their area and their local authority will have to deal with that. 54% support additional money for councils to respond to climate change locally, which is down 12% on last year. I think it's not because people don't see it as a priority, because the question discussed shows that 70% of them think it's something they'll have to deal with, but it's not a priority at the moment. I think this will come back. And I think what's more important actually is the third question, which we looked at: who is best placed to combat the effects of climate change? Now, people said that in their area, people said the councils were more best placed to do that, by 39% over the government at 31%. Last year it was tied, and I think councils being seen as best placed to combat an issue that, even if the effects are local, it's a global issue, is a significant trust expression. It's not a huge majority, and it's not even 50%, but it's a significant gap on something that I think government should be, if it's a global problem, they should be seen as the leader on. The top priority is for council to spend homes on making homes more energy efficient. This is the same result as last year, and broadly speaking, the people's priorities about what additional funding should be spent on remain the same. And also, last year, we asked people then to compare if climate change was thrown into the mix, and it still remains. Last year was the second priority for allocation of new funds, but then it's now the equal second, which I think, given the other pressing issues, is quite a strong, consistent performance. Climate change is an issue that won't go away for local councils, even if it's not quite the absolute priority at the moment. Let's go through the detail. 70% of people think the local community need to respond to climate change. That's only slightly down on last year, and I think it shows that this is an enduring issue of public's realization that this is an issue that they will have to address. As I said, 54% of people see councils as having to address that, and they'd like there more funds given from the central government to specifically address that issue locally. And whilst that is down 12 points on last year, I think that's a reflection very much of if people having current difficulties at the front of their mind. But as the previous question showed, it's an issue that will have to be addressed. But having said that, more than half of the population saying we want the government to give their local council more money to address the issue is very, very significant. Who do you think is best placed to address combat the effects of local climate change in the area? As I said in my introduction to this section, the local council and the government were tied last year. Now the local government has a clear 8-point lead. That's very significant, and I think that whilst some people say none of them, and some people say don't know, and a very small percentage see a private sector solution, the local authority public sector solution is seen as the most likely choice people will make. It's not everyone's choice, and I'd suspect if people were pushed who said don't know or none of them, I think the trust would fall to the local council as opposed to the government, which I think is a reflection of broader policies that the government is seen as failing on, as well as the relative success of local authorities. So what are the top priorities? The same priority, more energy efficient homes is where people given an option here of selecting as many as they liked, and the percentages, did somebody put, you could put 5x's if you wanted to, or 2x's, as long as you so how many people chose to put an X next to this box. 61% of people thought that more energy efficient homes was the number one priority. I think this is a huge issue, and I think local authorities being able to lead on not just on council houses, but perhaps even the provision of services for, if you like, retrofitting a whole street. The councillors, this is an area of growth that councils should strategically consider going forward as being as part of an ask for their area. People also immediately think of, even though they're satisfied with recycling, because they've seen the documentary about the plastics in the ocean and the effect that's had on fish and other wildlife in the ocean, people immediately do think of recycling and reducing waste. I think as of last year, whilst it's getting slightly less of a vote, people still support. There's a lot of interest in council being a green energy supplier and also improve public transport. Interestingly, we asked people the first time this year about cycling and walking, and it's just there behind electric car charging points, in slightly towards the bottom, not a very even score, but not it's very much a middle ranking choice when people give me that option this year, which is interesting how people are leaning towards infrastructure projects about energy and waste and recycling and home efficiency as being the preferred types of action. Lastly, greening public buildings it scores considerably less, as does improving local shops as a means of, if you like, reducing travel, and improving flood defence has actually got a significant lesser score than last year. But then last year, the survey was conducted prior to just after a significant event at Wally Bridge, which I think caught the public, where there's a threat of a flood following a major torrential rains, and I think that caught the public imagination just a little bit more. But it does reflect what people are currently thinking. That's unless you live in an area that's affected by that, it's less of an issue. Okay, so with the additional choice of local climate change action, we asked people to allocate their national £100 again, and people allocated 12% of their spend towards social care and road maintenance, affordable housing, and local climate action, all rounded at 10%. Affordable housing and road maintenance are about a tenth of a percent higher if I put in the full round, less without the rounding, but they're effectively the same score. That means that all those three things are seen as priorities. Waste and recycling collection is the next. and then we can see that most of the other services get a fairly even vote of funds out of the remaining, either 7 or 6% of. So people always give something to each one, but you can see the priorities are quite clear. That there's social care, but again, it's the over 55s who put a much higher score generally for social care, followed by road maintenance and affordable housing and local climate action. And I think there's a little bit of a split in voting between those under 50 where they allocate funds between climate action and affordable housing, which probably is a bit of a spread of the vote. Compared to last year, or compared to actually comparing this to when there's not the option of climate change, all the options go down a little bit. The light green is the option we discussed earlier in this presentation when there were 11 options, and the dark green is with climate change active. So they all go down a little bit, which is to be expected, except actually waste and recycling, which does the same things it did last year. That when you're ask a question about climate change, the spending last year on waste and recycling, because of probably public consciousness about the effect of plastics in the ocean and on landfill and on sea life and wildlife, is pushed by even the mention of climate change, is that people all have added a little bit more for waste and recycling by 1%, and they did the same thing last year. But otherwise, the broad pattern of spending is very much the same in terms of how people allocate compared to last year. So comparing spending from last year, which is, if you like, the final point, the dark is the spending level on social in 2020, and the light green is the 2019 allocation. And what you can see is that whilst the patterns of spend remain broadly the same, and the social care and climate change and affordable housing and road maintenance in that order remain more or less the top four. There's been some slight movements which show that in 2020 people slightly more appreciate their parks in COVID-19. They slightly more appreciate by an extra percentage point school meals. Both of those have a context of the campaign by Marcus Rashford, and obviously people having to spend a lot of time walking in their parks for exercise during COVID-19. Those things are up, but most things remain the same. And I think the level of, I think this presentation and the research shows a very broad level of satisfaction with council services, and a willingness to see and a trust in councils to implement the spending that they think those services need, and to manage the services and to make those decisions. So in summary, people's satisfaction levels are following similar patterns as last year, but they're up. People's trust in councils, relative trust in councils, is up, and that flows through to other services that might receive additional spending, whether that's in residential aged care or in addressing climate change. So that's the end of my presentation, and I think there'll be an opportunity to ask questions after that.